whether individualist, illegalist, propagandist of the deed, anarcho-syndicalist, platformist, Christian anarchist, or anarcho-primitivist, anarchism has had as many nuances as it has faces. And now that it appears to be confined to a minority, people forget there was once a time that it dominated the world. And yet in the years following the First World War, in Europe, anarchism seemed to have lost all of its influence. It wasn't just the terrorist attacks by the so-called propagandists of the deed, or the widespread decreeing of spurious laws which forced anarchism into the shadows, but rather the bullets and shells of Verdun and the Somme, which killed in some countries up to a third of working men, leaving them in the war cemeteries along the Chemin des Dames, and thus silencing the militants of the masses. Not to mention the millions of amputees, the brain damaged, and the seriously shell-shocked for whom revolution was no longer a priority. But outside of the industrialized nations of the West, anarchists survived on the edge of the great empires, taking up arms again and trying to deliver triumph to their ideals. And faced with reactionary tendencies, which also had numerous faces, libertarians could only imagine delightful utopias. During this fertile period between the wars, when capitalism gave birth to its two evil beasts, Stalinism and fascism, and faced with a totalitarian hydra which further generalized theft and industrialized death, they had to fight a war on two fronts and more than ever prove with their deeds the effectiveness of their thought. And thus the anarchists gave rise, not that we always remember, to some of the biggest revolutions of the 20th century, and wrote in red and black letters, a new page in our history. For 50 years on the continent of America, anarchists formed the backbone of social action. They were members of the Industrial Workers of the World, which spread its wings from Canada to Australia. They fought alongside FORA, the huge Argentine Workers' Federation. In Bolivia, they gave FOI a red and black flag as its emblem. In Chile, they organized mass demonstrations, and among the ranks of FORU, in Uruguay, they led shows of strength on the streets of Montevideo. They controlled the docks in the Caribbean, opposed fledgling banana republics, and fought for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico. In the United States, they protested on roller skates against unemployment and against war, brandishing the skull and crossbones. It was the anarchists, and not the communists, who prompted within successive US governments, despite the famous Red Scare, their darkest fears. In 1917, during yet another witch hunt, mass roundups were organized. Thousands of foreign anarchists were arrested as a prevention, held in prisons, and finally deported on the Buford, ever so subtly nicknamed the Soviet Ark. And as the land of liberty feared libertarians more than anything else, propaganda was spread against a backdrop of ragtime, smiles, and cartoons. Cartoons that amalgamated anarchist and Bolshevik vermin, assimilating them to rats that needed exterminating. Cartoons made by a joyous captain of industry who would end up showing his affection for the Nazi Party.
The United States is a country where the war against trade unions and other workers' movements was of an unparalleled brutality in the Western world, a brutality often enforced by the powers that be, aided by the mafia. Sounds unbelievable, but it's true. The government worked with the mafia to break the trade unions and the workers' movements.
There was a very strong repression in the United States, notably against Italian immigrant anarchists, who mainly adhered to the so-called anti-organizational tendencies. They were partisans who were in favor of expropriations, armed robberies, and so on. So the authorities took advantage of this situation to criminalize these activists. And Sacco and Vanzetti would pay the ultimate price.
Sacco and Vanzetti were two essentially rank-and-file anarchist militants who never would have been remembered by history except for what ends up happening to them. They are two followers of Luigi Galliani, the militant anarchist who promoted propaganda by the deed, who was also opposed to syndicalism, thought that unions were dangerous because they tended to be hierarchical, tended to be bureaucratic, and that he worried they would become barriers between workers and their goals. So he opposed unions as the vehicle to create revolution. Instead, looked to create large-scale insurrections, hopefully inspired by some of these acts.
Dozens of attacks were carried out targeting those who represented power, such as the billionaire Rockefeller and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, seen here viewing the aftermath of a bombing from his window. The authorities' eyes naturally turned to the movement led by Luigi Galliani, partisan of the propaganda of the deed. In his newspaper, Cronaca Subversiva, this lawyer advocated the direct, immediate, and individual use of violence. His booklet, La Salute en Voi, Salvation is in You, enjoyed a degree of success. In its foreword, what was basically a bomb-making manual was presented as a must-have for any proletarian family. For several years, his influence had grown within the Italian community.
Sacco and Vanzetti belonged to that current in the anarchist movement. They were militants. They believed in revolution by any means necessary, the sooner the better. At the time that they're arrested, they don't know that that's why they're being arrested. They think they're being arrested because they're anarchists and because anarchists are being rounded up. So they are very evasive when they're interrogated. They don't answer everything truthfully, which ends up being brought up at their trial and used as evidence against them.
On the steps of the Boston courthouse, thronging with reporters and onlookers, the shoemaker and fishmonger were accused of being the authors of an armed robbery which resulted in the death of 2 people late in 1919. Although neither of them had a police record, their anarchic tendencies were enough to see them charged. As the flashbulbs popped, this minor incident became a political affair.
It becomes a very, very high-profile case. There's an extremely large movement in support of Sacco and Vanzetti that grows not just in the United States, but worldwide. There's a Save Sacco and Vanzetti movement because an increasing number of people, not just anarchists and radicals, but liberals of various stripes, unions, become convinced that the evidence against them is extremely flimsy, which it is.
On American soil, anarchists tried everything to have the 2 prisoners released. Firstly with bombs, like the attack on Wall Street, the first car bomb in history, which resulted in 38 deaths and 200 injuries, but to no avail. Then through a legal battle, with appeals, cross-examinations, new trials, which despite their death sentence, managed to delay their execution for 7 years. And finally through a media campaign, with defense committees springing up pretty much everywhere. But although the campaigns to defend Sacco and Vanzetti were initiated by anarchists, as strange as it might seem, it was those across the globe, those who had become their worst enemies, who took up their defense.
It's of course ironic because the communists adopted their cause, but the communists, of course, at the same time were executing and imprisoning anarchists in the Soviet Union. So they certainly didn't have any real sympathy for Sacco and Vanzetti's political beliefs.
Today we know that Moscow took the decision to champion Sacco and Vanzetti to turn them into the symbol of bourgeois repression, capital repression, in the country that epitomized capitalism, the United States of America.
It also earned them moral capital, good feeling in the socialist and working class movements for them to champion these 2 Italian Americans who are facing death. And so they did manipulate the Sacco and Vanzetti case and use their martyrdom in order to further their own political interests. And that's very sad.
Unaware of the attempts at manipulation, but aware of the injustices carried out on anarchists, grassroots communist activists stepped up their efforts. On the Place de la République in Paris, France, in Tokyo, Berlin, Sofia, Asuncion, and Trafalgar Square in London, England, communists also protested against the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. but in vain.
Nevertheless, despite this widespread public outrage, they are both executed. They're sent to the electric chair in 1927 after their sentences are upheld. And it's a devastating blow.
The anarchist movement was crushed in the United States. And you weren't really to see much in the way of an anarchist movement in the United States again until the 1960s.
It would be many years for all the manipulation and exploitation to be denounced and admitted, resulting in the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, finally proclaiming that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. And 50 years to the day after their execution, thanks to Joan Baez singing, to music composed by Ennio Morricone, Vanzetti's last words, the death march of the anarchists finally became an international hymn for justice and freedom.
Here's to you, Nicola and Bart. Rest forever here in our hearts. The last and final moment is yours. That agony is your triumph. Here's to you, Nicola and Bart. Rest forever here in our hearts.
Anarchism then suffered by becoming a huge diaspora. A diaspora of Russian anarchists, North American anarchists, Italian anarchists. Naturally, many of them moved to France, because France wasn't a dictatorship. It was still a free democracy. So they emigrated to France.
The anarchist movement, which had hoped for a triumphant revolution in the aftermath of the First World War, found itself beaten on all fronts. And the question arose, why were we beaten?
In the Roaring '20s, Paris became the center of the world once more. Montparnasse took over the artistic baton from Montmartre. In the tinted light of the first neons at the Brasserie La Rotonde, Le Dôme, et Le Select, following in the footsteps of Courbet, Pissarro, and Seurat, artists were inspired by libertarian thought. Artists like Marcel Duchamp, self-proclaimed ant-artist, certain members of the Dada movement who published their early works in libertarian magazines, the first surrealists who adhered to poet André Breton's statement that an anarchist world or a surrealist world is the same thing. The Russian émigré painters seeking refuge in Paris, British and American authors, and those who remain unclassifiable, like Léo Mellet, Jean Dubuffet, Jean Vigo, and Jean Cocteau. Anarchism swept through the arts with its wind of freedom and rebellion. But far from the velvet-covered cafe benches, soon after the armistice, the workers' movement, with its 1.5 million dead and 4 million war wounded, paid dearly for the folly of a few men, and in the patriotic headlines that followed victory, workers gradually turned their backs on anarchism.
There was a real break, a cultural break, which resulted from society having been totally militarized for 4 years. That did not favor the growth of anarchism, and I don't think it was down to chance that the form the Workers' Party took after World War I was Bolshevism. Bolshevism had a hierarchical structure very similar to that of the factory and the army.
In the 1920s, despite the massive strikes led by revolutionary socialists, French society and the workers' movement began yielding, slowly but surely, to new tendencies. By founding the French Communist Party after the Tours Congress, Marxist-Leninists, strengthened by the seizing of power by the Bolshevik Party in Russia and the creation of the Comintern, began to attract the proletariat. The communists gained ground on the anarchists, took over their structures, and appropriated their martyrs and symbols, like the Internationale, which, after the removal of a few bothersome lines, became the Soviet hymn. The struggle led by Leninists across the globe also claimed its victims. 2 anarchists were killed in violent street fights over the control of the trade union headquarters. But as if that weren't enough, in the post-war years, anarchists saw a new threat rise up. For to mislead workers even more, to fascinate the working class, and to reassure the lower middle class, capitalism decided to wear its most spectacular mask yet: fascism.
The fascists had fought in the war and had learned the most evil lesson of war, which is violence. But unlike the violence of the revolutionary left, fascist violence was more professional. The fascists had learned during the war that violence needed to be extremely well organized.
The expansion of the fascist movement through violence was accompanied by an attempt to appropriate the symbols of anarchism. Such was the case of Action Française, presided over by Charles Maurras. It created the Proudhon Circle, a political think tank named after the founder of anarchism, so as to attract workers into its fold. It would become the cradle of French fascism. Or like Benito Mussolini, a former teacher and journalist who founded the Italian National Fascist Party and dressed his young militiamen in the black shirts of the anarchist movement. This son of a socialist revolutionary had even frequented leading figures of the anarchist movement, such as Lida Raffanelli, the Italian activist who converted to Islam, with whom he had a brief relationship as a young man. And it was probably this which gave rise to the legend that Il Duce himself had been an anarchist before World War I.
There's a wonderful anecdote which gives us an idea of Malatesta's intuition. In 1913, Malatesta returned to Italy and visited Milan, where he met with Mussolini for an hour. At the end, they said goodbye, and a friend of Malatesta asked him, "So what do you make of Mussolini?" Malatesta replied, "He's not a socialist, and even less an anarchist. He's a revolutionary who will clear lots of paths." Indeed, it's true that Mussolini had translated Kropotkin's The Great French Revolution into Italian, but he had never been an anarchist. Never.
And after Malatesta, anarchists were convinced that they would need to fight against the new European despots with violence, and they alone would fight against the threat with weapons. Like in Italy, where Michele Schiro, Angelo Spadolotto, and Anteo Zamboni, who would end up being lynched by a mob, plotted their own assassination attempts against Mussolini. In Spain, fascist dictator Primo de Rivera was the target, while in France, the heroic Germain Bertin shot down the chief editor of Action Française's newspaper. And in the United States, which had installed a genuinely apartheid regime, only the libertarians of the IWW dared stand up to the racist militia of the Ku Klux Klan. And let's not forget that in Germany, the anarchist Marinus van der Lubbe set fire to the Reichstag because it had become the antechamber of Hitlerism. But for the majority in the movement, individual response was no longer adapted, and it was during the debates held by the first anti-fascist fronts that they advocated what was for them the only possible response to the threat.
Among the anti-fascist fronts, it became a question of a lesser evil. If the principal evil was fascism, they would need to unite to fight fascism, and once fascism had been defeated, they would fight amongst each other, but dialectically, about the different ways to organize society. The anarchists didn't accept that. They believed they should fight fascism militarily and also fight with a social revolution. To them, the only way to eradicate fascism was through revolution, which would drain the financial and social foundations of fascism.
In June 1926, in Paris, a pamphlet was published entitled Organizational Platform of the General Union of Anarchists. It was a thunderclap in the small libertarian world, not only for the appeal it launched to unite the movement, which had always rebelled against all forms of organization, but also for the name of its principal signatory, a returnee from the ashes and tears of the Ukraine, then working on the assembly line at Renault, and whose body was one big scar, Nestor Makhno.
Makhno arrived in Paris, having experienced prison camps in Romania, Poland, and so on. And he arrived at a time when revolutionary ideals were in decline, because they were no longer the dish of the day across Europe. Plus, the image of the Soviet Union was positive enough for the communist movement to build itself upon. So the anarchist movement found itself extremely marginalized.
A number of anarchists believe that the origin of their defeat lay in the absence of organization, and the lack of togetherness between anarchist groups. And this point of view was upheld by the so-called Makhnovists, the supporters of Makhno, who would publish, with Arshinov, documents in which they declared themselves favorable to the founding of an organized anarchist body, based on the principle of collective responsibility, which they believe to be fundamental to taking up the fight again and eventually winning it.
Anarchism is no beautiful fantasy, no abstract notion of philosophy, but a social movement of the working masses. For that reason alone, it must gather its forces into one organization, as demanded by the reality and strategy of the social class struggle. The organizational platform published below represents the outline, the skeleton of such a program, and must serve as the first step towards gathering anarchist forces into a single, active, revolutionary anarchist collective capable of struggle. It's high time that anarchism emerged from the swamp of disorganization. Long live the organized anarchist movement. Long live the General Anarchist Union. Long live the social revolution of the world's workers.
Some may have interpreted the platform as a desire to copy the Bolshevik Party, but it was actually the transposition of what the Makhnovists stood for as an anarchist group, by which I mean the elimination of anarchism from artistic trends, from individualistic tendencies, and from terrorist anarchism. It was clearly a class war led by armed groups.
Rather than encourage the union of the anarchist movement, Makhno's appeal caused one of those endless debates that only libertarians were capable of. Responses flew in from across the globe. Oppositions, controversies, syntheses, total confusion reigned. And all this simply convinced Makhno and his followers even further that the anarchist movement needed discipline and unity. He decided to gather his supporters at Les Roses in the Paris suburbs for an international congress held on the 20th of March, 1927, at the movie theater Les Roses. Among those who attended were anarchists from Russia, Italy, Poland, Bulgaria, and even China, including the author Bajin. But at the time, Makhno was more focused on the situation in Spain.
Why Spain? People have often asked the question. Maybe because people don't like anarchists. It was Leo Ferré who said that. But more realistically, it's because in Spain, socialists were already viewed as anarchists. It wasn't a socialist tendency. In Spain, socialism was already seen as anarchistic.
Anarchism in Spain didn't just have working class roots, like in France or Italy. It had a genuine working class foundation made up of hundreds of thousands of activists.
A working class foundation which gave rise to a young 30-year-old anarchist mechanic who had sought refuge in Paris and had caught the eye of Makhno. His name, Buenaventura Durruti. They swapped stories, talked of past failures, and spoke of new possibilities. Durruti revealed his terrorist past, explained the already old organization of the Spanish anarchist movement, and told of his hopes for a revolution in Catalonia or in the plains of Aragon, which so resembled the steppes of the Ukraine. Impressed by the bravery, intelligence, and determination of the Spaniard, Makhno gave him a copy of his political manifesto and vowed that if a revolution were to be sparked in Spain, he would come to fight at his side.
What the anarchists represented and aspired to was a very lofty ideal that would take a lot of preparation. In Spain, they had been preparing for 70 to 80 years for the Spanish Civil War. So when revolution hit Spain, people were ready, because they had been preparing a long time for it.
In 1936, in Spain, the anarchists weren't only prepared because since the late 19th century they had carried out a number of propagandist of the deed missions, like the attacks by the mysterious Mano Negra, Black Hand, or the 1912 assassination of the Prime Minister by Manuel Parrilla Serrano, reconstructed here for a docudrama. Neither was it because some of the major martyrs of the cause, like the suspected anarchists garroted in Jerez de la Frontera, Francisco Ferrer, and the peasants murdered in the Casas Viejas, were Spanish. Nor was it because the Catalan anarchist newspaper rang out the same slogan ad for the Mexican Revolution. And nor was it because some of the major peasant and factory worker uprisings had taken place in the Levante, in Andalusia, in the Rioja in Catalonia, and finally in Asturias with the October Revolution, quashed by the young General Franco under orders from the recently elected center-right government. No, Spanish anarchists were ready because the libertarian movement had been solidly organized from its earliest days. Firstly, within a powerful Spanish section of the Workers' International Industrial Union, then within the FAI, the Iberian Anarchist Federation, and the CNT, the National Confederation of Labor, which, on the eve of Franco's coup d'etat, was one of the best structured unions in the world with the most members.
The world is vast, but it wasn't only Western Europe that had the strongest union power. But that wasn't all. The biggest organized social power, not political, because the term is ambiguous, was the CNT.
By late spring 1936, the National Confederation of Labor had about 1.5 million members throughout Spain, including half of all Catalonians.
With only one single paid bureaucrat, which is quite incredible if you think about it. One paid person in an organization that big.
In 1936, Macno had died and Durruti had returned to Spain. Elections took place. Anarchist groups which presented no candidates urged their members to vote for the Spanish Popular Front. And with millions of libertarian votes, the left wing won with a tiny minority and a government formed including socialists, Republican Democrats, and a handful of communists. The reaction from the right wing was swift. General Franco ordered all army regiments to take control of the country. Civil war had begun.
Franco's coup d'etat came about in 1936, and Spain burst open like a watermelon. On one side was the Progressive Front, and on the other the Fascist Front. And for 3 years, it was a violent face-off.
Like in Italy and in Germany, the upper classes applauded the putsch. Captains of industry provided finance for the fascists, and the Democrats abdicated. The government of the Popular Front, rather than call for resistance, resigned 3 times in one day. The people were left to their own devices, as half of the country fell under Franco's control. Libertarian groups launched an appeal for a general mobilization, and suddenly, in all spontaneity, as one, the anarchists answered the call. In Catalonia, led by Durruti, in charge of defending Barcelona, libertarians fended off right-wing forces. To the barricades, the hymn of the CNT, written by Valeriano Orobon Fernandez, a leading anarcho-syndicalist theoretician, in just a few hours became the battle cry of half a nation. Columns formed. Durruti was appointed delegated commander of a militia made up of volunteer freedom fighters. The column, with 3,000 men and women divided into several centuries, named after significant martyrs such as Sacco and Vanzetti, the Durruti column, along with the red and black column, marched on Saragossa, then converged one Aragon to confront the fascist armies. Inspired by the Macnovists, Durruti and his troops fought a war and led a revolution.
They forced fascism into a retreat, which later the Republican armies were unable to do. But that was notably in Aragon. And the moment that the Durruti columns liberated a village, they immediately proclaimed libertarian communism.
In cada pueblo aragonés,
In every liberated village, members of the Durruti column talked to the peasants. The anarchists told them to do away with the hedges separating the fields and to create vast collective zones and to work the land all together.
As they advanced, the libertarians chased out masters and gods and declared the end to all privileges. On the squares of liberated villages, lively new dances replaced the old laments. Couples formed in public. Land, work, and bread were shared. The elderly received retirement benefits, and people took time to enjoy life. New practices were invented, and solidarity was renewed. Anarchism deployed its thinking to the extreme. Farmers' assemblies, literacy campaigns. Over 800 Spanish towns and villages declared themselves communes, and one of the greatest collectivist experiments in history had begun.
There was an explosion of experiments. Whole towns, not just villages, did away with money. Great. But how would they live? So they invented something that wasn't in the writings of theoreticians, the so-called familial salary, where everybody worked together. But how do you share things? Based on individual effort? No, based on individual needs.
They abolished money. It seems unbelievable today, but thousands of people adhered to it and organized themselves around it. Naturally, on these liberated lands, the clergy was expropriated, and the former landowners found themselves working hand in hand with the peasants.
Things didn't go smoothly everywhere. The anarchists chased out the Guardia Civil and the fascists. But then Franco's troops reconquered the villages, and you can imagine the repression that came after. People mention the churches burned down, and the priests killed by the anarchists. It is true. It did happen. When power is seized by the people, it generates acts like that. Revolutionary anarchist Mikhail Bakunin himself said, "When revolution comes, it's inevitable that 100 heads will roll." 100 heads isn't a lot compared to the horrors committed by the fascists.
With almost unlimited material sent by Henry Ford and the support of Italian troops and the infamous German Condor Legion, Franco and his followers launched a campaign of social and ideological cleansing. Like in Seville, where 8,000 people were bayoneted to death, or at Guernica, where men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered by Luftwaffe bombs. Despite widespread fears, the request for arms made by the libertarians to Western democracies went unanswered. The anarchists could, however, count on the international solidarity of the movement which, in newspapers and conferences, appealed for supporters to join the ranks of the insurgents. The Frenchman Sébastien Faure, anarchist burglar Marius Jacob, the Algerian Mohamed Say, the Argentinian Diego Abad de Santillán, the Belgian Louis Mercier Vega, the Russian Georges Sosenko, and political activist Simone Weil, who enrolled in the Durruti column, like Emma Goldman, who at 67 years old fought in Catalonia. From all around the world, men and women arrived in Spain to support the revolution, and with the first international brigades, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade made up of mostly IWW members, the Malatesta Battalion, nicknamed the Battalion of Death, and the Louise Michel Battalion from France, foreign revolutionaries, as they arrived, suddenly brought about a change.
In their countries of origins, whether they were French, British, American, or Italians or Germans who were in Franco's camps, at no time had they ever encountered an anarchist movement on such a huge scale. George Orwell wrote a wonderful account. In Britain, he frequented not a communist milieu, but a Trotskyite milieu, and he came to Spain to fight. When he arrived in Barcelona, it was a big discovery for him. In Britain, he had no idea that the anarchists existed and even held the city. His account has a slightly odd title, Homage to Catalonia.
In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice, it was not far from it. There is a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean that the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had almost disappeared. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master.
As the international brigades left to reinforce the anarchist columns on the front, to the rear, now aware of the key role that propaganda could play, the libertarians took over the film industry, and with the little money they had, shot newsreels of the fierce battles they were fighting in Aragon. But in this war of images, in which for the first time it was they who were doing the filming, the anarchists made sure to report on the scale and specifics of their revolution as CNT cameramen captured live footage of an insurgent capital.
The first report on events in Barcelona was made by the CNT, the Union of Public Spectacle. They went out onto the streets to film what was happening at the barricades. We have some marvelous footage of a city in revolution. We don't have any of St. Petersburg or other places. But here we have footage that tells what a city in revolution is like.
These images show a city that is practically anarchist, with an incredible popular enthusiasm that has never been reproduced in our history.
These newsreels revealed to the world the scale and coherency of the Spanish libertarian revolution. Amidst the remains of the barricades and the destroyed centers of power, documentary makers such as Félix Marquet captured each step in this great upheaval. Here, anarcho-syndicalism was working at full steam. All forms of bureaucracy, non-productive jobs, and the role of foreman were abolished. Major decisions were taken in councils, work was carried out in common, and production means recuperated by the collectivity. In Catalonia, far from the industrial heart of Spain, over 75% of companies were self-managed. Tramways, taxis and buses, hotels and restaurants, bakeries, fishing, foodstuffs, textiles, the leather and shoemaking industry. All these small businesses, like large companies, were now managed collectively with no fall in efficiency or production. The revolution even made inroads into culture, which suddenly became popular and social once more. Movies, classical music, opera and cabaret were managed directly by the actors, dancers, musicians, technicians and ushers, who were all members of the CNT. Emma Goldwyn, who was 67 when she arrived in Catalonia to support the revolution, wrote,
"The collectivization of the industries and the land stand out as the greatest achievement of any revolutionary period. Your revolution will destroy forever the idea that the anarchist project means chaos. Moreover, if Franco should win and the Spanish anarchists be exterminated, the work they have started will continue to live."
It means that anarchism can work, but on what condition? On the condition that the majority of people believe in libertarian principles. So it's possible to found a society without authority and without government, or with a minimum of authority and a minimum of government.
The triumph of anarchism in Spain found a last but paradoxical expression on November 4th, 1936, when the Republicans decided to form in Madrid a new government of victory. So as to rally the different anti-fascist groups against the Franco forces for the first time in history, 4 libertarians became ministers.
On the one hand, their presence was in order to reinforce the government, but it was also a way for the anarchist militia to obtain arms. So it was give and take.
But they were ministers with no real importance. They entered government with a strategic aim. They did it to have some control over the government, to prevent the government carrying out anti-anarchist acts.
In practice, the anarchist militia didn't really obtain more arms, and in the eyes of the combatants, this entry into government was at the worst a betrayal and at the best a mistake. So a split formed between the grassroots anarchists and the 4 ministers.
The anarchist movement began to break up. The Communist Party, also with representatives in the government, began to play a more preponderant role thanks to the military backing provided by Stalin, and they were intent on taking advantage of the split. The Communists demanded that the libertarian revolution be adjourned and the anarchist militia disarmed, then drafted into a regular army under the command of political commissioners sent specially by the Soviet Union. The government and the 4 anarchist ministers voted for the proposal. Durruti saw it as a betrayal. He spoke out.
"If you don't want those who are fighting to mistake you in the rear ground, for our enemies, then do your duty. The war we're currently fighting is being fought to crush the enemy at the front. But is it our only enemy? No. The enemy are also those who oppose revolutionary conquests, those who are amongst us, those we will also crush."
In the eyes of the Stalinists and the Republicans, Durruti and his column, which held Aragon, had become too strong, too dangerous, and too radical. It was urgent to seize back control.
The moment he wanted to change things too radically, the reformists turned against him. The Stalinists, who wanted to found a society with a strict hierarchy, turned against him, and obviously the bourgeoisie was against him. And it was at that moment that the Republicans were caught in a dilemma, and many of them began saying, "We prefer fascist order to anarchy."
To weaken the anarchists and to have Durruti in their control, the government decided to order his column to Madrid, which was under siege from Franco's forces. The libertarians smelled a trap, but Durruti hoped to use the occasion to relaunch the revolutionary process in the Spanish capital. His death, which came about in mysterious circumstances, gave rise to the most outlandish of rumors.
He was in a car and he wanted to check out the situation. So he got out, and when he came back to the car, he died. More precisely, he was shot. One of the first interpretations was it was an assassination. A shot like that from close range can only be an assassination. And this rumor was immediately spread by Franco's camp in order to say that the Republicans had started killing each other. This theory was then taken up by the communists, who said that the anarchists were just a disorganized bunch of petits bourgeois who were killing each other. But I think it was an accident. In the car was a soldier holding a rifle. On a lot of rifles back then, the safety catch didn't work very well. And as Durruti got in, he took a bullet. During the Civil War, saying that a figure like Durruti had died in a stupid accident caused by a misfiring gun would have sounded ridiculous.
Still today, the circumstances of Durruti's death remain unclear. His body was transported across the country to Barcelona. A cortege of over 500,000 people made its way to the Montjuic cemetery where he was buried. It was the last large-scale public show of force made by the anarchists during the Spanish Civil War.
Durruti was an icon. And without Durruti, anarchism had lost its figurehead.
Anarchism is a political theory which advocates the destruction of power. It's not a strategy for political conquest. Communism, on the other hand, is. And the communists, who numbered only 10,000 compared to millions and millions of anarchists, managed in under a year, with the backing of the Soviet Union, to take control of things.
And that's when the Great Repression started, which would culminate in the events of May 1937 and the violent clashes in which the libertarian revolution was crushed.
It was during what anarchist historians call the May Days of '37, part of which is featured in the movie Land and Freedom by Ken Loach, that the revolution was crushed. It began with the Battle of Telefonica. Since the beginning of the revolution, the anarchists had controlled Barcelona's telephone central. The Republicans, allied with the Stalinists, were determined to oust them. The fuse was lit. The people of Barcelona raised barricades. Despite calls for calm from the anarchist ministers, they faced off like at Kronstadt 15 years earlier. Only this time alongside the Trotskyists of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, practically unarmed against 3,000 fully equipped and highly trained assault guards.
The clashes lasted all week. Remember that Franco's putsch in Barcelona had been put down in 2 days. But the fighting here, between the base and the government, lasted 7 days, with over 1,000 dead and hundreds wounded.
After the defeat of the anarchists during the May Days of '37 and the ensuing repression, the gates of Barcelona were open to the fascists. The Republican and Stalinist government could now step up counter-revolutionary measures in the small territory still under its control. On May 25th, the Anarchist Federation was excluded from the People's Court. On June 6th, governmental decree made all rural collectives illegal. In early August, the Regional Council for the Defense of Aragon was definitively disbanded. At the end of August, criticism of the Soviet Union was officially banned. On January 6, 1938, the government prohibited by decree the issuing of money by the committees. And later in 1938, the government annulled all that remained of the collectives and reinstated all rights to wealthy landowners. The Spanish Libertarian Revolution had been quashed, and in Moscow, Pravda declared in its editorial, "The cleansing of anarchists has been completed with the same gusto as in the Soviet Union."
The Spanish Civil War ended on April 1st, 1939. Many anarchists were interred in concentration camps, but many of them also faced the firing squad.
It's unbelievable when you compare the number of CNT and Anarchist Federation members just before the Spanish Social Revolution with the number that remained just after the fascist victory. People might think this was the result of fascist repression, but in fact, it was mainly repression by the Republican government in line with the wishes of the Stalinists. And all historians confirm this. The Spanish Civil War was a deeply traumatic episode in 20th century history, even if it's not an episode that immediately comes to mind when you examine 20th century history. I see it as a huge turning point. It was a bloody and truly horrible event in 20th century history. The abandonment by European democracies, the Italian fascists, the Nazis, Stalinist Soviet Union. The whole of Europe ganged up to ensure the experiment failed, and fail it did.
As they crossed the Pyrenees amongst the thousands of refugees heading into exile, those who had survived the war continued to ask themselves why they had lost and where and when they could resume the fight.
The situation of the anarchists after the First World War was extremely difficult. But after the failure of the Spanish Revolution, it was catastrophic. What option did they have left to them? To join up with the Bolsheviks? To convert to fascism? If they wanted to keep up the fight, what could they do? Join the French army to fight the Nazis? What else could they do to save their skins?
In April 1939, World War II was yet to break out. But on seeing the concentration camps in which France greeted the survivors of the revolution, how could Spanish anarchists not feel dismayed? Especially when French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, who had already reimposed the 48-hour working week and signed the Munich Accords, decided to appoint as the first ambassador to Franco, Philippe Pétain, the most noble and most human of our military leaders, according to Léon Blum at the time. But the situation was even more difficult for them, as it was for all anarchists across the globe, because the counter-revolution was triumphing everywhere. In fascist countries, of course, but also in socialist republics and liberal democracies, reactionaries added to their list of victims, like during the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937 in the United States, when the Chicago Police Department shot and killed a dozen workers, including a woman and 3 children, and wounded many others. And as usual, in a world gradually being covered with barbed wire, the libertarians were the first targets of repression. From Le Vernet to Oranienburg, they were rounded up, deported, and some, like Erich Mühsam, executed. For in this context of a global capitalist crisis, the crushing of revolutionaries constituted to the bourgeoisie the necessary preliminary for its desire to expand. And imperialism as we know it in the past and in the present, while constantly uttering the word peace, had long been preparing for war. Spain, along with Abyssinia and Manchuria, was much more than a dress rehearsal for war. In reality, all the non-aggression pacts that were signed merely accelerated the process which was already underway. And the sole aim in exacerbating nationalist sentiments was to prevent workers from uniting. So it was imperative to wipe from all memory all those men and women who had abolished the state, currency, and frontiers, and had tried with all their might and against all odds to build a better world. And it was thus in the dark days of a new world war, which would unleash the most barbaric of passions and turn the planet into a field of ruins, as workers were drafted into regiments, fanaticized, reduced into slavery or to ashes, that the last words of Durruti could be heard as an echo.
We've always lived in poverty, and we can continue to do so for some time. But don't forget that we, the workers, are the only generators of wealth. We operate the machines, we extract coal from the mines, we build the towns and cities, and we know that we will only deserve ruins because the bourgeoisie will try to destroy the world in the last instance of its history. But we have no fear of ruins because we carry a new world in our hearts.
Car notre sang bleu et noir, notre drapeau rouge et noir.